Hello chess friends, this is International Master Valeri Lilov, and today I would like to talk on the topic of traps. See, truth is that traps are not that easy. And one of the reasons is because when we think about traps, when we think about, like how do you set up the opponent in a more difficult position, there's going to be a lot of, people that are just going to say, okay, it's not that easy to do that. It's really not. But they will be right. It's not easy. But what you might want to be thinking about, and I do recommend you to consider this, is that a lot of times, you have to keep in mind that your strategy is actually based on one thing. Setting up a trap that genuinely allows you to keep your opponent under pressure. Whether it's going to be, like pressuring a pawn or anything else. It depends. But let's take a look right now. I mean, what I want to show you is a common trap that often occurs in blitz games. It's interesting because not everybody will actually play it like this, but it's quite a beautiful thing. So I want to show you how that's done. Let's take a look. White plays g4. Now this is not a common move. I want to put it up again because it's not something that we could do oftentimes or enjoy that line. But after d5, I've seen oftentimes people play bishop to the g2, and then after the move of bishop to the g2, black plays bishop takes to the g4, c4, c6. So we have that kind of position. c6. Interesting. It's protecting, keeping everything together. So exactly what's the way to play here? Do we have any counterattack? Do we have any possibilities? It's tricky. The way to think about such a position, essentially, is to look at simply one move, one candidate. And that is c takes to the d, c takes to the d, and queen b3, which is really brilliant. It forces not just the attack against the opponent's the d5 and b7 itself, but it actually brings a lot of problems, a lot of pressure, so we could say, against black's position in particular. It's an excellent resource. It's a beautiful thing to do. Look at the opponent's weaknesses. Ask yourself, what are the vulnerabilities that he's having? And once you discover that, hone your pieces instantly against that type of a weakness. And then once this is done, it's just so beautiful. And, there's really not too much to worry about. A great move leading up to a powerful idea. What about black now? Well, maybe he can try e6, although then we can play queen to the a4 check. And that's going to be a really amazing thing to do, so he doesn't get the chance to make so much more. That's a beautiful thing. So, again, that doesn't win, and this is actually the thing about traps. The difference between many grandmasters and rather weaker opponents is that the grandmasters themselves often rely on something very specific. They rely on the ability to put the opponent, to make him be in a much less active position. Now, is it possible to do? Yes, it is. How do we do that? For example, after queen b3, there could be knight to the f6 in this moment. And in fact, actually, after the move of queen takes to the b7, we get a nice threat. Black plays knight d7, we can do knight c3, but then black will play with the move of e6 in this position. And it's very easy. Black could continue with the move of, let's see, bishop to the d6, and then black can continue with the move of queen e7, short castles, queen e7, rook b8. Anyway, black plays e6, queen a4 check, and then we could win a piece. Otherwise, just play knight c3 here, knight f3. And yet, the trap itself did not work because there was no center. There was very little in terms of good preparation. And because of that, because of the bad control, black could simply solidify, and our trap goes nowhere. White's actual trap left him with a pawn that was so important that the king cannot now castle, right? And there's just so much more to say. So, yeah, you have to be very careful when it comes down to moves like g4. And just generally, when you're setting up a trap, better make sure that it has a solid positional background. Because if you do not have a solid positional background, this type of pawn break, or whatever you call it, will likely turn against you. And you just do not want to be in a position of that kind, ever. So that's important. Yeah, after the g4, we could say that, this is going to happen. What other traps exist? I mean, possibly we could say there's f4. f4 is an interesting resource. The idea being is that now white can control e5. So if black plays d5, white can do knight f3. And so black could try c5, potentially. And this could be a moment for white to play b3. So this is a really important variation. Knight c6, bishop b2. Now this is not so much of a trap as it is about really developing in the proper way. Most of the white pieces are now going to develop pretty effectively towards the center. And if black just does not, follow any consistent and good development, white is going to be dominating pretty effectively. So let's see. Knight c6, e3, knight f6, bishop b5. If black does bishop d7, white can actually castle on the short side. And for instance, if black plays bishop to the d6, we could continue with queen e1. Or we can even do bishop takes to the c6, bishop takes to the c6, knight e5. We have a strong looking knight, which is going to be positioned most powerfully in the middle. And then we could also see how if black attempts to protect it, which is okay, by the way, but if he defends it like this, then white is going to do very quickly the candidate of knight e5. And it's a wonderful, now we can have a4, sort of prepping ourselves up for the possibility on the queen side if black decides to go in there. Or on the other hand, if he doesn't, if he plays a move like short castles, white can simply line up this queen and go forward to advance on the king's side. It's really not going to take that long to do it, but it is beautiful. Just let's keep it up. Go forward, advance against the opponent, and realize different type of you could say even threats that will come out in no time. It's a beautiful idea. So this is good. It's not necessarily perfect, but it's pretty good. This is why I often say just give yourself the time to set it. It may take time, maybe anything, but definitely want to do it this way. And so let's see. Actually, after this, what about other sort of traps that I know? Well, Grandmasters often tend to post traps with e4. And the idea being is that after the move of e4, let's say black plays c5. So it's kind of interesting. When people do c5, say, you can do knight c3. Now, one of the biggest traps that I've seen is the so-called Grand Prix attack trap. Now, it's quite exciting because at first it doesn't really look like there's going to be too much to worry. And yet, that is until this moment where we are really already breaking through and, opening up some incredible attack against the opponent's position. It's very, very easy. For instance, castles, knight f6, d3, short castles. Most of the correct traps begin out of a very easy development, very comfortable set of the pieces that we do. And next move, of course, if black plays bishop d7, white plays queen h4. Now, when you really look at that, you'd say, all right, this is not horrible. I mean, black could definitely manage his activity on the queen side with moves like this. Truth is, he could, of course, but it doesn't matter because even if he does get to do it this way, then what we could continue with is the move of f5, which would be a powerful thing. and then after g takes f, bishop h6. The trap is that if black actually stands up in a position just like this, we're going to be much more perfect and prepared to deliver threats on that side of the board. So you could see for yourself the reason why this is good. On the very next move, if he plays anything like, it actually doesn't matter so much what he's doing, but let's suppose that he plays a move of f takes to the e or anything, we could just keep gathering more pieces on this side of the board. We can gather more attacking forces on that line so that he's got enough things enough to suffer through all this. So the point is always just get more attackers on the line. Get yourselves in a more dangerous position, because if you do, if you do put your opponent in this type of position, then we have a lot of different resource tactical things and ideas that could so effectively move along and push, especially when we play rook f3 to the h3 in this case. That's what we'd like to be going for. So yeah, this is easy. And what about black? I don't know really. Maybe e6, but then we play e takes f. Now we have this approach to go for e6 pawn with f takes d, rook e1. It's just a lot of great pieces, much of the pressure that's being created, and black has enough things to be concerned of, because of the attack out there. So it's easy, it's simple. And it's really, really nice to play along. So it's good to see. Is there more to that? Sure, but I really love the approach here. One of the biggest things that you have to remember in these positions is the pressure. It's all about, where do I go? Okay, I want to play on the king side. And just line up as many pieces as you can right down in that area. So you do that, and we have everything to follow. So this is an interesting possibility. And for instance, after continuing with e takes f5, d5, maybe bishop takes the g7, we could break through very quickly. King takes g7, queen g3, with the threat of knight takes to the e6, and that's all you have to remember. That's all you have to keep in mind. So this is basically the main idea as to why this is played and how it turns out more useful. So this is it. Now, what about black? This is really, really important. Talking about black's openings. Setting up trap as black is limited because it's up to white on how you play it. For example, if white plays the move of, let's say, maybe you can play e4, okay, then essentially we can continue with c5, knight f3, d6. There is no way for you to trap because you're always trying to counter in this position. And black could just do the move c takes to the d. And for example, in case white plays with the move of, let's say, knight takes d4, then knight f6, knight c3, and a6. So you're not really trapping anything. Now, are there traps within the Sicilian that black could set? Yes, they could be, but you're mostly behind. Now, if you want to set up traps, probably you can look at the d4, because in d4 there are more opportunities. Like, for example, the e5, the Budapest. Now, the Budapest is very tricky. Now, again, there is no guarantee that your opponent will actually go into this. But let's talk about it. Knight comes up there. So what's the trap here? Well, white can play knight f3, black could do knight c6, and white can play bishop f4, trying to protect the pawn. Now this is important. Black can counter with bishop b4 check, knight bd2, queen e7, and now in case of e3, knight g takes to e5. Knight takes to e5, knight takes to b5. Now, this is how it's supposed to go normally with an equal position after this exchange. But of course, there are other ways to play it. For example, if we go for f6, for instance, e takes f6 and queen takes f6, you could trap white into trying to protect his pawn and the bishop. That could result in bishop to b4 check very strongly, knight c3, exchange, and castling, which suddenly gives black this wonderful set of strong pieces, great open lines, and a possibility to keep the attack going. It's really interesting to see this follow and understand why is it so important. It not only helps black to follow through, but also to create different type of attacks that are all relevant in their own way. So this is good. What comes next? Well, that's a really great question. Actually, it could be a few things that definitely come out, but I have to admit that none of them is great for white. Here is an example. After that move gets played, certainly white has an obvious problem with some of his pieces. So what he might need to do in this case would be to play, okay, let's suppose e3 or something. And then after the move opponent to the e3, black could do d6. You see, so it's not so much a problem of the general position. It's a problem of structure. See, white hasn't got any good structure at this moment. He's got a problem with the bishop, problem with the pawns, and then maybe we could even play with a move of b6 to simply line up the bishop on b7, the rook on e8, and also consider the terrific knight e5, so that the bishop from b7 can open up and shoot in that area. It's quite decent to see. And to tell you the truth, that's often what you're really looking for. Let's get the pieces right, set them across the center, and maybe we could focus a little bit along the way to attack on the king's side shortly after that. Now again, the traps that black could set, as I mentioned earlier, are much more difficult. But it's possible to do it. Now let's discuss a couple of different versions. For example, there's an interesting trap that black could set. If white plays d4, now let's imagine that black plays d5, c4, and e5. Now, a lot of people consider this to be a kind of a bad system, and there is some truth in that. However, there is also something pretty important about this approach, and the important idea is that as we go by playing this move of e5, in case white gets to play up with the d6 to the e, then we're going to be ready to continue with a move like, say, d4. Now, if people know how to play this opening, likely nothing great is going to come out of this, so it's fine. But there are a lot of people who wouldn't. And so, for instance, against those kind of players, you could set the trap. The trap is, if he plays with e3, going against the d4 pawn, we can play bishop b4 check. If white does bishop d2, we're ready to play d6 to the e3 with a capture. F takes to e will lead to two double pawns that are fairly bad on their own, as if they go like this. Or, if white happens to capture the bishop on the b4, then we can play e6 f2 with a check. And see, this is really important. So we could capture, we could be checking his king, and if he comes up to e2, we can go f takes to the g, not with a queen, but with a knight, doing a check, forcing him to take back, and then we could do bishop g4 to force the king out of the way once more time so we could capture the queen. It's really powerful, I mean, if you really think of it that way. There are other moves too, like for instance knight f3 could be played out, and then maybe you could try e3, but again, bishop b4 and d6t will cause some significant weaknesses within white's position. So after the d6 to the f takes to the e3, even if the trap we're setting does not necessarily kill him, it's going to maintain a pretty strong pressure due to his big weaknesses and many of his other pieces that just don't feel like they're doing anything. We could do queen takes d1, king takes d1, knight takes b4, and I have to certainly say that in an endgame like this with those type of pawn weaknesses, he's going to have a lot of things to be worried about. Whether it's going to be bishop g4 we do, long side castles, or knight g6, it's all going to get ready, and we can play it along the way of the fast and easy development and pressure that we can create. Strong. It's easy. What about white? I mean, what if he just plays normally with something like g3? Of course he could, but then we can do bishop g4. And now one of the interesting traps is after queen d7, short castles, long side castles, queen b3, and knight e7. If white isn't aware of what to do, black can get not only a great pressure and the ability to return the pawn, but also the chance to step on and get going on the king side, get going very successfully, very effectively, I have to say. It's really, really interesting what can actually happen. This is why White has to play a lot more precisely if he's to avoid getting in this type of difficulty. See, choosing an exotic opening has its own risk, and of course you could set up a trap just by making it look natural. But no, to be honest, if you have a good base for the trap, for the position, if you have a good base for the trap you're going to set, do it. If there is a risk or the trap is known to be something that could make you suffer, my suggestion would be pass. Play it correctly, keep it up. In Blitz, of course, you could try anything, and usually this is where most traps work. But in classical chess, you have to be aware of the kind of trap you're going to place. If you believe it has this strong potential and possibility to help you long term, okay, you can do it. But if it doesn't, or if it wouldn't, I will recommend that you don't go for it. So this is my take on generally how you can think about tactical traps. Now let's talk about positional traps. I like to give you a very interesting concept about positional traps in this way. When people think about traps, they think, okay, I'm going to checkmate him, or I'm going to win big material. Truth is, you could set positional traps that will get him in a position with either no opening advantage or similar problems that will haunt him for a while. It's a good example to see one of the openings that I most like, the so-called Stonewall. Now, Stonewall, especially beginning with d5, is something that not everybody would expect. And exactly for this reason, when it happens, it just looks kind of, okay, it's a bit unexpected, that's for sure, but at the same time, it looks a little harmless. So White can just play knight c3, f5, knight f3, he will be okay in bringing up his knight, and he wouldn't mind it. Now, what I want to tell you is that this is the actual trap, because it looks kind of harmless does not mean that it is. And so, for instance, after we play in c6, imagine g3, knight f6. Then, of course, there is the candidate of bishop g2, followed by bishop d6. We're gradually setting up the position that will guarantee us a very strong and effective development as the game progresses. Here is a good example. Castles, b3, and of course b6. Bishop b7, b2, bishop b7. See, the trap over here, being more positional, is really within the fact that if White does not take any action to do something, it does not matter what, how he plays it. For example, if the knight at the d7, we could very quickly realize that should White play a move alongside a move of knight queen to the d3, we could very effectively play alongside knight e4. This is a powerful move. He cannot take it because we're going to recapture and then win material. And he cannot not take it, of course, because then, we've got a great knight looking there. So if he plays, for instance, with the move of, let's suppose, rook to the d1, that is a great moment for us to play a move like, say, maybe queen to the e7. We're going to get our rooks together. We're going to have the opportunity to step forth. And then in case of e3, there's going to be, of course, the move of rook to the c8. Like anything that he does, maybe with rook to the c2, could lead us to playing rook d8. And that's where the actual trap was, because we're just going to get a really beautiful set of pieces. The pieces are well set. The support is going to be really nicely done at that moment, and we don't have anything to be really that much worried about. It's a good continuation. It's a great setup. Now, is there more to that? Of course. I mean, maybe what we could be thinking about is White will play a4 or whatever. Then we play knight f6, knight e2, c5, and all of that. With c5 in line, we get a great pressure, a glimpse of a serious attack that comes against the opponent's d4 pawn. And surely after that move is played, in case he plays c takes d, e takes d, it's a great support in the center, really valuable position to play with. So here is a great example of a positional pressure that could leave the opponent in a rather difficult position. Not necessarily, but quite a bit of it, yes. Look at the power of black's pieces now lined up purposefully towards the center, and the ability for him to support and back it up with moves like knight g4. If I play something like h3, we could very quickly do a move like c4 if needed, d takes to the c, maybe even d takes to the c, and bishop takes g3. It's only going to take a couple of moves, but you see, it begins very unpretentious, and then it transforms into something that anybody would love to have, just because of the command that is being created and maintained between the pieces. It's beautiful that way. It's really good. Now, are there other positional traps we could be aware of? Of course. One of the many is the so-called, actually, we're going to talk about white, the so-called e4 versus d6 setup. Now, I'm not, again, I don't want to confuse people by saying this is entirely wrong for black, but the e4 versus d6, especially the Maroczy bind setup that could go, is extremely painful. For instance, we could see this happening in a couple of different versions. One of them could be this one, knight f3, knight pawn to the d6, imagine d4, exchange, and then knight x to the d4. Knight f6, we could play f3, and then after e6, we could go with the move of pawn to c4. Strengthening the position and then getting the e4 and c4 to control the d5 and b5 is amazing. We could set out to play the move of knight to the c3, and then we can go with the move of bishop e3, a6, bishop to the e2 in this position. Really beautiful. What I like about this variation is that the c4 and e4 are controlling the d5 and b5 squares, so that now black doesn't have a practical opportunity to advance, or he shouldn't be playing anywhere there, because we've got e5 and other moves. And that causes a lot of extra problems towards this position. A lot of them exist here. For example, knight c6, castles. Queen c7, rook c1. This setup could exist also in different type of lines. For example, we could say that this will exist in a normal variation. If, for example, black plays, what can we say? Let's say, okay, here, d4. You know, one of my most favorite setups is the Catalan setup. Catalan setup going with knight f3, d5, g3, whereas the main goal for white is to play the bishop on the g2, then castle short, and then later play with the move queen to the c2 and knight bd2. Now, why are all these moves so relevant? They are because what white is really preparing to do is the move of pawn to e4. Pawn to e4 by itself is a brilliant, drastic move that just kind of kills, most of black's possibilities around the middle, and that's what we're actually going for in this position. And so, just it could be very relevant, very dangerous. And for instance, in case he comes up with a move like d takes to the e, knight takes to the e, knight takes to the e, and queen takes to the e. There we go. We've got the attack. We've got the tactic. Black plays with something like knight to the e, knight up there, we could go immediately with the candidate move of queen e2, and it's pretty awesome. Don't want to say necessarily big, but it's pretty good. The sequence is good. The activity feels like we have the shot to advance and attack against him differently. Bishop f4, then bishop, or even knight e5 may be played out too. It is one of the more virtually powerful ways of leading up. d4 versus e6 is almost always a clear advantage for us, so you'd like to get it in as many games as possible. It is effective that way. It really is. So those are my thoughts on setting up traps, positional or tactical. Something to definitely consider and think about whenever you play these positions. I hope that makes sense, and good luck in creating your own traps.